So this is the first of two videos that are going to talk about dividing by fractions. And in those two videos, we're going to go through what it means to divide, a different way of looking at division that's going to be more helpful when it comes to fractions, what we mean by unit fractions and non-unit fractions, and then how we can understand what it means to divide something by a fraction, and then go through all of those other things such as dividing using mixed numbers, and then in class get to some other extensions of it as well. So the first thing we need to talk about before we can even get into dividing fractions is to understand what it means when we're talking about division. And there are lots of different ways that division is presented in younger grades. So the first question that I'm going to ask you to pause the video and brainstorm a bit with is, what is division? For example, what does 12 divided by 4 actually represent? How do we think about it? What concepts are we using, etc.? So go ahead, pause the video, take 10 to 15 seconds to write down some thoughts about what you have, and then come back when you're ready to move on. And so there are two primary ways that you probably came up with thinking about division. The first division, if we're using a concrete example here, like dividing 12 apples by 4, the first way we can think about it is splitting it into equal groups. And so this is, well, okay, so we're going to split these 12 into equal groups of 4. So we can take this group of 4. That's one group of 4. Here's another group of 4. And we can see when we divide it into groups of 4 that we have 1, 2, 3 groups of 4. And that's a great way to think about positive number division when our divisor divides evenly into the dividend, because we can see that there are equal groups. Another way that we can look at it, one that's going to be more helpful when it comes to fractions, is how many 4s do I need to make 12? We're going to end up at the same answer. We're going to think about it very similarly, but the focus of it is not creating groups of 4, it's how many of those 4s. So there's the 4 once, there's the 4 twice, there's the 4 a third time. And so that's how we're going to have to think about division. How many of the divisor do I need to create the dividend? That's going to be the most helpful when it comes to dividing by fractions, because fractions, it's very hard to say split something into groups of 3/4. But this video is not about dividing by regular fractions, it's about dividing by things called unit fractions. And a unit fraction is a fraction where the numerator is 1. Examples of unit fractions would be things like 1/21, 1/2, 1/5, 1/32, 1/73, etc. All of those different things, as long as the numerator is 1 and the denominator is a positive integer, we can call it a unit fraction. So for an example of dividing by unit fractions, we can say, okay, we have a watermelon. And we want to split that watermelon into fourths. And the natural question would be, how many fourths of a watermelon can I make out of a single watermelon? Or how many fourths of a watermelon do I need to make one? And because we're looking at division as how many of something do I need to create something else, that is, in order to make 1, how many fourths do I need? That is the same question as 1 divided by 1/4. How many 1/4 make up 1? Now this is pretty nice and easy because we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's also true because 1 is the same as 4/4. So we can think about this very intuitively, that to divide 1 by 1/4, we just say, okay, well 1 is the same as 4/4. So therefore, 1 divided by 1/4 is 4. It takes 4/4 to make 1. To come to a slightly different example, let's say that we have a stretch of road that's a mile long. And what we want to do is we want to run that mile, but we want to run that mile 1/5 of a mile at a time. Because sometimes, depending on whether there's a hill, to how much you've run before, it can be difficult to run that one whole mile all at once. So what if we decided to break it up into 1/5 mile segments? Well, that's 1 mile broken down into groups of a 1/5. Or how many 1/5s does it take to make 1 mile? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/5. 1 is the same as 5/5. So therefore it takes 5/5 to create a mile. That's how many 5ths does it take to create 1? And we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that all comes about, this idea of dividing 1 by a unit fraction all comes about because we know how many of a certain denominator it takes to make 1, 5/5, 7/7, 12/12, 18/18, etc. That is all the basis of what we're doing when it comes to unit fractions and dividing it by 1. So we can extend that to say, what if we wanted to do 4 miles in 1/5 of a mile segments? How many times do you need to run a fifth of a mile to make it 4 miles? And that question is the same as 4 divided into fifth mile segments. How many fifths does it take to make 4? And in this case, it's not just 1 mile that we're talking about 4 miles. But that 4 is just 4 equal groups of 1. So if there are 5/5, like we said, in 1 mile, 5/5 in the second mile, 5/5 in the third mile, and 5/5 in the fourth mile, then this 4 divided by 1/5 actually becomes the same as 4 equal groups of 5/5. Or you would need to run that 20 times to make it 4 miles. And that's because 4 breaks down into 4 equal groups of 1 mile. This 1 divided by 1/5 is 5, or 1 mile times 5/5 in that mile. This one is the same thing. This one is the same thing. This one is the same thing. So 4 divided by 1/5 is actually 4 groups of 5/5, or 4 times 5 of those to create 20 as our answer. And that, again, is because 1, we understand the way that 1 breaks down into fractions of 7/7, 9/9, 12/12, 5/5, and we know that whole numbers are copies of 1. So it's very easy to see why this multiplication becomes the way it is, and why 4 divided by 1/5 will give us a larger number, a greater number, because it takes lots and lots and lots of copies of 1/5 to make 4. It takes 5 to make 1, so it takes 4 times 5, or 20, to make 4. And that brings us to the idea of what it is to divide by a fraction. To divide by a fraction, divide by a unit fraction, you have to multiply by the denominator of that unit fraction. So if we're taking in numbers, first, on the right, if we're taking 5 and dividing it by 1/7, each of those 1s in 5 requires 7/7. So 5 is 5 times 7, or 35/7. In general, if we're just using variables, because we're talking about it in terms of the algebra also, because this is true no matter what the number is, if we have any number n, and we're dividing by the fraction 1 over a, n divided by 1 over a is always n times a. And if it isn't entirely clear why that happens right now while you're watching the video, we are going to talk about it more in class. Write down those questions that you have. But go ahead, pause the video, write down the dividing by unit fractions methodology here. Write down the algebra, write down the numbers, everything that you see, except for the stuff that I've written down. Pause the video, write down in your notebook, and come back when you're ready to move on. So the example, it doesn't matter, like I said with the algebra, it doesn't matter if our n, this first number that we're dividing, our dividend, is a whole number. We can have a fraction. So we can do 3/4 divided by 1/2, and that question becomes, how many halves does it take to make 3/4? Well, there are 2 halves to make 1. So we're just going to take 3/4 of those 2 halves. Because remember, dividing by 1/2 is the same as multiplying by 2. So when we actually get through and do this multiplication, like we talked about in class, we can simplify. So I'm going to simplify here. The 2 and the 4 can both be divided by 2 to make 1 and 2. 3 times 1 is 3. 2 times 1 is 2. It takes 3 halves, or 1.5 halves, to make 3/4. So the answer, the quotient, 3/4 divided by 1/2, is 3 halves. And we can do that with mixed numbers, we can do that with whole numbers, we can do that with fractions. So go ahead, pause the video. You're going to work on these problems here, these 4 problems. Remember, dividing by a unit fraction, for example, dividing by 1/3, is the same as multiplying by 3, because every one whole unit is comprised of 3/3. And our question we're asking is, how many thirds does it take to make whatever our dividend is? Like 5/7 divided by 1/14, how many 14ths does it take to make 5/7? And that, because we're going to turn to multiplication, all mixed numbers need to turn into improper fractions. So pause the video, work on those, come back when you're ready to move on. So for 5/7 divided by 1/14, again, dividing by 1/14 is the same as multiplying by 14. 5/7 times 14 over 1. We can simplify the 14 and the 7 and get 5 times 2 is 10. 1 times 1 is 1. So 5/7 divided by 1/14 is 10. It takes 10/14 to make 5/7. For 8/15 divided by 1/5, again, dividing by 1/5 is multiplying by 5. Times 5. That 5 and 15 can be simplified by 1 and 3, and therefore 8 times 1 is 8. 3 times 1 is 3. So it takes 8/3 copies of 1/5 to make 8/15. On the bottom left, we have to convert this to a mixed number. So this is 11 over 5. Dividing by 1/20 is the same as multiplying by 20 because every one of those 2 and a fifth involves 20 20ths. And here we can simplify again. The 20 and the 5 can be simplified by 5. And that gets us to 44. It takes 44 20ths to make 2 and a fifth. And then for 1 and 2 ninths, again, we have 11 ninths. We're going to multiply by 21. 21 and 9 can be both divided by 3. All right, so that is 7 and 3. 11 by 7 is 77. 3 times 1 is 3. And so 1 and 2 ninths divided by 1/21 is 77 over 3, or 77/3. It takes 77/3 of a 21st to make 1 and 2 ninths, which means that we can't make 1 and 2 ninths just out of 21st. It takes a little piece of the 21st to actually make that happen. So as a quick review, for dividing by unit fractions, when we're dividing by that unit fractions, dividing by 1 over a, like 1 over 7, is the same as multiplying by that denominator. And we can use that strategy, and we'll use that more both in class and when we get to the next video lesson on dividing by non-unit fractions.